For most of human history, the concern wasn't around issues of overpopulation, but simply around survival. When agriculture began to take hold around 12,000 years ago, estimates are there were only between 1 and 15 million people worldwide. Even at the highest estimate, this would be less than the population of 17 individual cities today. Actual population numbers are unclear, as before the 18th century, few governments even attempted any kind of comprehensive census. The Egyptians and the Persians were likely the first to make any kind of serious effort to count, but both did so only for taxation and military purposes. And even where the counts were made, various records of people existing in various places are more often lost to time. But when we take what we have and make reasonable estimates, most agree that around 1 AD there were between 150 and 300 million people in the world, and 1,000 years later, estimates were there were between 250 million and 400 million. This was growth, but not exponential growth. Where civilizations began to expand, disease, war, and famine would often follow, checking the population expansion. By 1492, estimates were still only between 425 million and 600 million worldwide, or roughly populations doubling every 1,500 years or so. But that was also the first year of the Columbian Exchange. In the New World, native populations collapsed due to disease being brought from the Old World, for which they had little or no immunity. Estimates are between disease and war, between 80 and 90% of the native population passed away. However, going the other direction, to the Old World from the New, came foods such as corn, potatoes, and tomatoes, which became staples of many cuisines and cultures over the next 500 years. These foods didn't exist in Europe, Asia, or Africa prior to the Columbian Exchange, and they completely changed the food landscape. Coming to the New World from the Old were many domestic animals that didn't exist in the New World, such as horses, pigs, cattle, sheep, goats, and chickens. Bringing these things together vastly expanded both the amount and quality of food production worldwide. Potatoes, for example, were able to yield around 3 times the calories per acre of wheat or barley, while taking only 3 to 4 months to mature versus the 10-month growing season for wheat. Potatoes, in addition to being more nutritious, could also be grown in soils where wheat couldn't. Corn was also more productive than wheat, having a yield more than double wheat per acre, and became one of the main sources of animal food in addition to being another food option for people. With more food and more food variety, life expectancy grew and child mortality fell, leading to population growth. Food shortage became food surplus, leading to expanded trade, which then spurred the need for infrastructure improvements to allow people to bring goods longer distances to increasingly dense population centers. In places like the Netherlands, this density and the need to grow food efficiently led to experiments in land reform. Crop rotations and enclosures grew and shared open fields and pastures declined. Soon these new ideas spread far and wide, leading to even more food and even more growth. The population explosion was particularly notable in England, where in just Great Britain and Wales between 1700 and 1800, the population grew from 5.5 million to over 9 million. This even with a large number of people leaving England to settle in British colonies around the world. Seeing this surge in population, in 1798 an Anglican clergyman by the name of Thomas Malthus anonymously wrote an essay on the principle of population, where he argued population would grow exponentially until it ran out of resources and then collapsed. He argued, quote, "Through the animal and vegetable kingdoms, nature has scattered the seeds of life abroad with the most profuse and liberal hand. The germs of existence contained in this spot of earth, with ample food and ample room to expand in, would fill millions of worlds in the course of a few thousand years. Necessity, that imperious, all-pervading law of nature, restrains them within the prescribed bounds. The race of plants and the race of animals shrink under this great restrictive law, and the race of man cannot, by any efforts of reason, escape from it. Among the plants and animals, its effects are waste of seed, sickness, and premature death. Among mankind, misery and vice." Malthus made this argument as a response to other more optimistic scholars who had wrote rather utopian arguments around the ongoing population boom. He disagreed, stating, quote, "This natural inequality of the two powers, of population and of production of the earth, and that great law of our nature which must be constantly keep their effects equal, form the great difficulty that appears to me insurmountable in the ways to the perfectibility of society." The essay was widely read and influential, but also attracted a great deal of criticism. Malthus decided to identify himself as the author in later editions of the essay, and expanded on his arguments in reaction to the critics. In the second edition, he wrote, quote, "A man who is born into a world already possessed, if he cannot get subsistence from his parents on whom he has a just demand, and if the society do not want his labor, has no claim of right to the smallest portion of food, and, in fact, has no business to be where he is. At nature's mighty feast there is no vacant cover for him. She tells him to be gone, and will quickly execute her own orders. if he does not work upon the compassion of some of the guests. If these guests get up and make room for him, other intruders immediately appear, demanding the same favor. The report of provision for all that come fills the hall with numerous claimants. The order and the harmony of the feast is disturbed. The plenty that before reigned is changed into scarcity, and the happiness of the guests is destroyed by the spectacle of misery and dependence in every part of the hall, and by the clamorous inopportunity of those who are justly enraged at not finding the provisions which they have been taught to expect. The guests learn too late their error in counteracting those strict orders to all intruders issued by the great mistress of the feast, who, wishing that all guests should have plenty, and knowing she could not provide for unlimited numbers, humanely refused to admit fresh comers when her table was already full. Malthus removed this specific passage from later editions due to the backlash from his critics, and he bristled at the accusations that he was uncaring when his writing was cited by some in the government to argue against charity for the poor. But he didn't back down from the argument. Malthus's later writing argued that unless combined with church requirements around celibacy and marriage, programs that provided aid to the poor were problematic. He wrote, quote, "Wherever indiscriminate charity exists, it will never want objects on which to exercise its bounty, but will always attract expectants more numerous than it has means to gratify." Also in the second edition, Malthus began proposing solutions to overpopulation. He argued for sexual abstinence and later marriages. But Malthus, as a devout Anglican, argued birth control was not a solution, as it was, quote, "morally indefensible, along with infanticide, abortion, and adultery." But his plans seemed to go unheeded based on birth records showing premarital pregnancy continued to rise throughout this era. Malthus died in 1834, but his thoughts and ideas remained very influential for some time after his death. One group advocated for what was called voluntary motherhood, where they argued sex should only be for procreation. Another group, despite Malthus's objection to birth control, called themselves the Malthusian Leagues and specifically advocated for birth control and birth control education, which was largely illegal at the time. In the scientific community, Charles Darwin specifically said that Malthus's work was formative in his development of the theory of evolution. He wrote, quote, "I happened to read for amusement Malthus on population, and being well prepared to appreciate the struggle for existence which everywhere goes on from long-continued observation of the habits of animals and plants, it at once struck me that under these circumstances, favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed." Darwin's cousin was a man by the name of Francis Galton. Galton was greatly influenced by both Darwin and Malthus. Galton was, by most accounts, a mathematical child prodigy. Throughout his life, he made significant contributions to a number of fields, from meteorology to criminology, generally in research based around mathematics and measurements. Despite his mathematical aptitude, he had a nervous breakdown while attending college and attempting to obtain advanced degrees. This was one of several such breakdowns, according to his biographers, that would occur at times of high stress. Many years later, Galton would say, quote, "Men who leave their mark on the world are very often those who, being gifted and full of nervous power, are at the same time haunted and driven by a dominant idea, and are therefore within a measurable distance of insanity." After the death of his father, Galton found himself financially independent and was able to travel throughout the Middle East and Africa for several years, before returning and joining the Royal Geographical Society, where he won several awards for his writings on his travels. When Darwin published The Origin of Species in 1859, Galton became fascinated, spending much of the rest of his life doing data analysis studies on human variation. Galton created a methodology to statistically analyze human traits and wrote a book called Hereditary Genius in 1869. In that book, Galton noted that people who were, quote, "eminent" in a given profession were more likely to have children who were also eminent in that profession. He took this as evidence for hereditary inheritance of abilities. Galton believed, quote, "there is no escape from the conclusion that nature prevails enormously over nurture." But Galton had a problem in the math of his argument. First, the strength of this eminence effect dropped off the further removed a person was from the first eminent person, until after about 3 generations the effect seemed to disappear almost entirely. Second, his data showed that from generation to generation, regardless of the size of the population or the growth in population of one set versus another set, the distribution of the various factors he accounted for seemed to exist in roughly the same distribution, something that wouldn't happen if the driving factor was genetic inheritance. What the data instead showed was something that would come to be known as regression to the mean. He developed a device known as a Galton board, which demonstrated what he was observing in the data. This was a vertical board with a row of pegs where beads can be dropped in from the top. Over time, because of the inherent randomness of all the factors going into the board, the beads would eventually form a bell curve. This curve matched the data that Galton was seeing, but it's not what would occur if Galton was correct and the genetic advantage specifically outweighed any trend toward the norm. Galton initially tried to argue it was similar to dog breeding, where he said, quote, "If a man breeds from strong, well-shaped dogs, but of mixed pedigree, the puppies will be sometimes, but rarely, the equals of their parents. They will commonly be of a mongrel nondescript type because ancestral peculiarities are apt to crop out in the offspring. But if this was the case, you wouldn't see much of a curve over large groups, with others not genetically attached themselves seemingly becoming positive outliers as those who are genetically connected, quote, regressed. But this curve is exactly what you would see if environmental factors were more important. As modern geneticist Nicholas Gillam would later say of Galton, quote, he dismissed the obvious objection that an eminent father was more likely to find a suitable position for a son than one less fortunate, that his environment might be important too. But because Galton did not see this, he instead had to come up with an alternative theory, which he published in a paper titled Regression Toward Mediocrity and Hereditary Stature. He proposed what he called Galton's Law of Ancestral Heredity, in which he argued that parents only contributed half of the traits of the children. He argued the other half were coming from distant ancestors, each with diminishing influence. Grandparents would contribute a quarter, great-grandparents an eighth, and so on. This, he believed, would explain the regression, as he argued additional traits weren't coming just from the two parents, but from this ancient genetic pool separate from the parents. However, when Gregory Mendel's research was rediscovered in the 1900s, it clearly showed that the law of ancestral heredity was wrong. There was no secret pool of ancestors. It was just the two parents and occasional genetic mutation. Unfortunately, broad understanding that one of the core foundations of Galton's argument was built on a factually wrong belief wouldn't come until long after the idea had taken root. In 1883, Galton coined the term eugenics, citing the Greek word eugenes, stating, quote, "This is, with questions bearing on what is termed in Greek eugenes, namely, in good stock, hereditarily endowed with noble qualities. This and the allied word eugenia, etc., are equally applicable to men, brutes, and plants. We greatly want a brief word to express the science of improving stock, which is by no means confined to questions of judicious mating, but which, especially in the case of man, takes cognizance of all influences that tend, in however remote degree, to give a more suitable races or strains of blood a better chance of prevailing speedily over the less suitable than otherwise they would have had. The word eugenics would sufficiently express the idea. It is at least a neater word and a more generalized one than viriculture, which I once ventured to use." In choosing this word, Galton was almost certainly aware of the Greek historian Plutarch's account of the Spartan culture, where he claimed a council of elders would inspect newborn children to decide if the child was fit to live or die, and if deemed unfit, the child would be thrown into a nearby chasm. This was not the only example of this line of reasoning, and it was not unique to the Greeks or even to Europe. A study looking at the genealogical records of over 36,000 men from 6 Chinese lineages between 1350 and 1920 showed that those who had degrees or held offices were more than twice as likely to have surviving sons than others, a statistical variance that was almost certainly would not occur without outside actions. But the rise of Christianity in Europe had largely eliminated the practice of selective infanticide, to the point that, as noted, even contraceptive was viewed as sinful. Galton defined eugenics as, quote, "the study of all agencies under human control which can improve or impair the racial quality of future generations." Many colleges and universities made the study of eugenics an academic discipline as a result of his research. It should be said that Galton himself, quite naively, had a very different view of how his ideas would be implemented than what actually occurred. Galton stated, quote, "The best form of civilization, in respect to the improvement of the race, would be one in which society was not costly, where incomes were chiefly derived from professional sources and not through inheritance, where every lad had a chance of showing his abilities and, if highly gifted, was enabled to receive a first-class education and entrance into professional life, by the liberal help of the exhibitions and scholarships which he had gained in his early youth, where marriage was held in high honor as in the ancient Jewish times, where the pride of race was encouraged. Of course, I do not refer to the nonsensical sentiment of the present day, that goes under that name, where the weak could find a welcome and a refuge in celibate monasteries or sisterhoods, and lastly, where the better sort of emigrants and refugees from other lands were invited and welcomed and their descendants naturalized. But there are other ways to understand the idea of survival of the fittest. Alfred Russel Wallace was a contemporary of Darwin who had conducted research very similar to Darwin's, only by studying the Malay archipelago rather than the Galapagos Islands. Wallace and Darwin wrote back and forth for years, finding themselves largely in agreement on the overall concepts of evolution, Wallace's findings were in fact so similar to Darwin's that they were presented alongside each other in London just prior to Darwin's publication of Origin of Species, and some has even gone so far to say that he was more or less a co-discoverer of the theory of evolution. But while the two largely agreed on the key concepts around evolution and survival of the fittest, they came at it from different angles. Darwin's focus was more centered on differences between individual creatures and the competition between them in a given space. Wallace, on the other hand, seemed to view it more as a competition between life and the various environments creatures encountered. Wallace wrote, quote, "It then occurred to me that these causes or their equivalents are continually acting in the case of animals also, and as animals usually breed much more quickly than does mankind, the destruction every year of these causes must be enormous to keep down the numbers of each species, since evidently they do not increase regularly from year to year, as otherwise the world would long ago have been overcrowded with those that breed most quickly." Vaguely thinking over the enormous and constant destruction which this implied, it occurred to me to ask the question, why do some die and some live? And the answer was clearly, on the whole, the best fated live. And considering the amount of individual variation that my experience as a collector has shown me to exist, then it followed that the changes necessary for the adaptation of species to the changing conditions would be brought about. In this way, every part of the animal's organization could be modified exactly as required, and in the very process of this modification, the unmodified would die out, and thus the definite character and the clear isolation of each species would be explained. For Wallace, it wasn't simply a question of which of the creatures was more fit, but also which was more fit to adapt to the context into which it was born, and which creatures had enough variety that some of their kind might find ways to survive in each area. For example, a polar bear is very well suited for a polar environment, but quite unfit in almost all others. But it's still a bear, likely descended from brown bears, which are themselves well suited for a very different environment. Fitness is therefore more about the challenge being confronted than the individual being challenged. Putting focus on individuals within a species also creates problems when studying species in communal groups. The evolutionary outcomes of a queen bee don't make much sense without the context of her working in synergy with the rest of the hive, for example. Looked at in this context, the regression to the mean and the bell curve that Galton observed is exactly what one would expect. Human beings grow up in interconnected societies, and those societies identify and train individuals to fit roles needed by the community. We adapt to meet the needs of the environment. Through training and education, people can gain aptitudes in the roles that are needed, or if they do not, either for lack of skill or interest, they will find themselves shifted into other roles until at some point the crucial needs of the community are met. Galton himself would present a complicated eugenic question. On the one hand, he was by nearly all accounts a mathematical genius. On the other hand, he suffered a series of significant mental health episodes leading to nervous breakdowns throughout his life. Were these two truths of Galton separable? Or is each outcome a product of a far more complicated interaction between genes and environmental factors? If it's the latter, the regression observed would make sense, while if they were simply a genius gene some had and some didn't, the math wouldn't show the regression he observed in his research. Would a eugenicist view Galton as coming from a positive genetic line because of the mathematical genius, or one to exclude because of the mental instability? And this doesn't even get into the issue of inbreeding, which would almost certainly arise from selective marriages, unless you're rather fond of the Habsburg chin. What Galton's own genes might have produced is a mystery. He had no known children after 43 years of marriage. I say no known as rumors of his sexual exploits while exploring were cited by biographers, including his likely suffering from a venereal disease, which probably reduced his libido later in life. But his ideas around, quote, positive eugenics lived on long after him. The first president of Stanford University, David Starr Jordan, was a vocal advocate for eugenics, writing in 1899, quote, "For a race of men or a herd of cattle are governed by the same laws of selection." In 1902, he wrote an essay entitled "The Blood of the Nation, a Study of the Decay of Races Through the Survival of the Unfit," in which he argued that in addition to Galton's positive eugenic approach of encouraging those who were genetically superior to have children, society must also act against what he eventually labeled as, quote, dysgenics. With the goal of addressing both positive eugenic and dysgenic concerns, various eugenic societies began to form all around the Western world. In 1907, a 21-year-old widow by the name of Sybil Gatto was inspired by Galton to create the Eugenics Education Society, of which Galton was an honorary president from 1907 until his death in 1911. Gatto was trained as a rescue worker in shelters for young women, and said that as a result of these experiences she became motivated to find ways to end prostitution and venereal disease. She argued the young girls who had become single mothers were taken advantage of, usually by older men, and was frustrated by the lack of knowledge other rescue workers had on the topic of contraceptives. She believed that if these women had access to contraceptive education, they might have been able to avoid their current circumstances. One of the first proposals made by the Eugenics Education Society was to call for Parliament to pass a law that would segregate alcoholics in order to prevent their reproduction because alcoholism was an inheritable genetic trait. It failed to pass in 1913. After Galton's passing, Leonard Darwin, son of Charles Darwin, became the second president of the Eugenics Education Society. In 1916, the society published a pamphlet entitled Quality Not Quantity, where they argued professionals should have more children. In 1917, Sybil wrote an article entitled The Eugenic Principle in Social Reconstruction, in which she argued for what she called, quote, eugenic selection. She believed some people were genetically superior, and that even if born into poverty, they would be able to rise, and those genetically inferior born into wealth would sink into poverty. They argued it was therefore dysgenic to fund programs for the poor and pushed instead for wealthy families to be given additional money to encourage them to have children. In the United States, some eugenicists went even further, even sooner. In 1911, a man by the name of Charles B. Davenport, using money from the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Institute, and the widow of a wealthy railroad tycoon named Mary Harriman, was able to create the Eugenic Records Office. This office collected information, mostly through questionnaires, to identify genetic traits for use in eugenic research and advocacy. This research was used in the 1920s to pass a number of laws in the United States based on eugenic arguments. A former school superintendent from Iowa by the name of Harry H. Laughlin became the head of the organization and testified before Congress in support of the Immigration Act of 1924. He argued, among other things, that insanity tended to be prevalent among immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, that 83% of Jewish immigrants were born, quote, feeble-minded, and that they were both a threat to the nation's genetic makeup and economy as a result. He also wrote, quote, a model eugenic sterilization law, which over time became adopted in one form or another by 30 states. One of those states was Virginia, which in 1924 authorized, quote, sterilization of mental defectives. Even before this law had passed, a man by the name of Dr. Albert Sidney Pretty, who was superintendent of the Virginia State Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, had performed hundreds of sterilizations. He argued he was allowed by laws which said he could perform surgery to benefit, quote, the physical, mental, and moral condition of those in his care. He claimed that the operations were to relieve, quote, chronic pelvic disorder, and according to his own writings, he chose women who were, quote, immoral because of their, quote, fondness for men. He described some as having a reputation for promiscuity, being, quote, oversexed or man-crazy. In one instance, he sterilized a 16-year-old girl for, quote, talking to the little boys. With these acts now officially legal, Pretty filed a formal request with the board of the hospital to sterilize a woman by the name of Carrie Buck. Carrie's mother had been committed to Pretty's hospital after she had contracted syphilis and been accused of prostitution and, quote, immorality many years prior. When she was institutionalized, Carrie was taken from her mother and placed in foster care with John and Alice Dobbs. Carrie was, by all accounts, an average student in 1st through 6th grade, at which time the Dobbs removed her from school so that she could help around the house. When she was 17 years old, she became pregnant, reportedly as a result of being raped by the Dobbs' nephew. When she was found to be pregnant, court records of a Red Cross social worker statement read, quote, Mr. Dobbs, who had charge of the girl, had taken her when she was a small child, had reported to Mrs. Duke that the girl was pregnant and that he wanted to have her committed somewhere, have her sent to some institution. She was then committed to the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded, where she gave birth to a daughter named Vivian, who was taken from her as she was institutionalized and given to the Dobbs. That daughter, by all accounts, performed normally academically and behaviorally, even making the honor roll in April of 1931, a year before her untimely death at the age of 8, likely from complications from measles. Pretty argued that because Carrie's mother had been institutionalized, and that now Carrie herself had also been institutionalized, that Carrie was a genetic threat to society and should therefore be sterilized. This case eventually went to the United States Supreme Court. In a clear conflict of interest, Carrie was represented by a man by the name of Irving T. Whitehead. Whitehead was a personal friend of Mr. Pretty, a known eugenic advocate, and he had previously served on the board of the colony. Unsurprisingly, the Supreme Court affirmed the law 8-1, allowing forced sterilization of not just Carrie Buck, but people generally. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes wrote, quote, We have seen more than once that the public welfare may call upon the best citizens for their lives. It would be strange if it could not call upon those who already sap the strength of the state for these lesser sacrifices, often not felt to be much by those concerned, in order to prevent our being swamped with incompetence. It is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. The principle that sustains compulsory vaccination is broad enough to cover cutting the fallopian tubes. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Not only was Carrie Buck sterilized against her will after the ruling, but her half-sister Doris. Doris not only did not give her consent, but did not even have knowledge of it. Doris had been institutionalized at the age of 12 on accusations of promiscuity and feeble-mindedness. She was 16 years old when she was told she was receiving an appendectomy procedure, but in fact, they were sterilizing her. She would only learn years later after she and her husband were unable to have children. Shortly after being sterilized, Carrie Buck was released from custody. She lived until 1983, and the numerous researchers and reporters who met with her over the years after her sterilization described her as being of normal intelligence. One wrote, quote, "As for Carrie, when I met her, she was reading newspapers daily and joining in a more literate friend to assist at regular bouts of crossword puzzles. She was not a sophisticated woman and lacked social graces, but mental health professionals who examined her in later life confirmed my impressions that she was neither mentally ill nor retarded." Between 1907 and 1963, at least 64,000 people were sterilized based on eugenics laws in the United States, and these laws were not unpopular. A 1937 poll found that about two-thirds of the respondents supported eugenic sterilization of, quote, mental defectives, while about 63% supported sterilization of criminals. Only about 15% of those surveys were opposed to both. Eugenics became so normalized that even some black intellectuals were in support at least the concept. No less than W.E.B. Du Bois himself was quoted as saying, "Only fit blacks should procreate to eradicate the race's heritage of moral inequity." To this end, in 1929, a black social worker asked famed birth control advocate Margaret Sanger to open a clinic in Harlem. Sanger aided in getting funding for this clinic, staffing with black doctors and nurses, and having it directed by a black advisory board made up of prominent members of the black community. Attempting to build off the success of the clinic in Harlem, Sanger proposed expanding the concept of the clinic to places in the Deep South, but to the surprise of probably no one who's ever studied American history, the eugenics argument was instead used to justify racist beliefs and create new racist laws. Laws against interracial marriages had already been widely adopted, but now gained more genetic specificity. In that same year, Virginia passed the law legalizing sterilization. It also created calculable standards for whiteness by passing the Racial Integrity Act of 1924, which defined a white person as having, quote, "no trace whatever of any blood other than Caucasian, but persons who have 1/16 or less of the blood of the American Indian and have no other non-Caucasic blood shall be deemed to be white persons." Black women were disproportionately targeted for sterilization. In North Carolina, for example, of the approximately 7,600 women sterilized, 5,000 were black. In California, despite black people making up only 1% of the total population, 4% of the sterilizations were performed on black people. Senate subcommittees in the 1970s discovered at least 2,000 black women in the South were sterilized without their knowledge, let alone their consent, all paid for by federal government programs. In Puerto Rico, between 1930 and 1970, nearly a third of the female population was sterilized through a federal program targeting Latinos. California's Sterilization Act of 1909 was one of the earliest in the country and also one of the most widespread, with an estimated 20,000 sterilization procedures being performed in the state between 1909 and 1963. Although the records did not specifically identify those of Latino descent, based on studies of surnames, estimates are as high as 88% of those sterilized being Latino. California eugenicist and founder of the California State University in Sacramento, Charles Goethe visited Germany in 1934, and on his return wrote to a colleague, quote, "You will be interested to know that your work has played a powerful part in shaping the opinions of the group of intellectuals who are behind Hitler and this epoch-making program. Everywhere I sense their opinions have been tremendously stimulated by American thought. I want you, my dear friend, to carry the thought with you for the rest of your life that you have readily jolted into action a great government of 60 million people." Even after mass sterilization programs came under scrutiny during the Civil Rights Movement, they continued against other groups. Between 60 and 70,000 Native American women underwent sterilization procedures from the Federal Indian Health Services in the 1970s, which amounted to about 40% of all Native American women in the area where it occurred. Although the Indian Health Service denied this was a result of coercion, They did acknowledge that they did not comply with a rule that required, quote, any individual contemplating sterilization should be advised orally at the outset that at no time could federal benefits be withdrawn because of failure to agree to sterilization. And likely they lied about the reversibility of the procedure while failing to provide other alternatives. And many eugenicists didn't believe sterilization was enough, arguing the government should euthanize those deemed unfit. In 1938, the Euthanasia Society of America was founded by a Unitarian minister by the name of Charles Francis Potter. Members of the group supported both voluntary and involuntary euthanasia, with some members of the group proposing using gas chambers to, quote, humanely execute those with developmental disabilities. In July of 1933, Germany passed a law based on Harry Laughlin's model sterilization law, which translated to Law for Protection Against Genetically Defective. The law ordered compulsory sterilization of people who had diseases believed to be hereditary, such as schizophrenia, epilepsy, and, quote, imbecility. Sterilization was made legal for alcoholism and other perceived deviant behaviors, leading to an estimated 360,000 sterilizations between 1933 and 1939. With the rise of Nazi Germany beginning to enter the public eye, questions started to be raised about the quality of the research being conducted by the Eugenics Research Organization. In 1935, the Carnegie Institute, which had created the foundation, convened a review panel to look at the information provided. It included scholars from the Galton Laboratory, which was named after the founder of eugenics, as well as noted economists and statisticians. The review concluded that the research and findings made by the organization lacked scientific merit and were riddled with errors and inconsistencies. One person examining the research wrote, quote, what prompted both these gentlemen to commit these errors was apparently their intense desire of one to associate with, and of the other to disassociate from race the incidence of the various social inadequacies. Facts were therefore selected in such a manner, and the method of interpretation were so chosen as to yield the desired support for their preconceived conclusions. As a result, the Carnegie Institute withdrew funding, more or less ending the organization. Harry Laughlin, who had written the model sterilization law, was undeterred and seemingly embraced the actions of Nazi Germany. In 1936, he was given an honorary doctorate by Heidelberg University in Germany for his work on, quote, science of racial cleansing. While he couldn't attend in person, he told colleagues he was proud of the award and it showed, quote, common understanding of German and American scientists of the nature of eugenics. Laughlin went on to help found the Pioneer Fund in 1937. Its purpose was, quote, to advance the scientific study of heredity and human differences, with an additional stated purpose of encouraging the children of those, quote, descended predominantly from white persons who settled in the original 13 states prior to the adoption of the Constitution of the United States, and or from related stocks, or to classes of children, the majority of whom are deemed to be so descended. One of their first acts was to fund distribution of a Nazi eugenic propaganda film which advocated euthanasia of the mentally disabled. Laughlin was president of the fund from its founding until 1941. He proposed research to assist Southern states in enforcing racial integrity laws by finding ways to identify those who might, quote, pass for white, so a person could not, quote, successfully hide all of his black blood. Laughlin himself had no children, dying in 1943 after a series of severe seizures, which many have speculated were the result of a hereditary epilepsy. As World War II began, Nazi Germany shifted from sterilization to murder. From September 1939 to the end of the World War, between 275 and 300,000 people living in psychiatric hospitals were killed by German authorities. The technologies developed for these mass murders in psychiatric hospitals were later integrated into concentration camps. In September 1935, the Nuremberg laws had set up racial-specific criteria for citizenship. Taking a cue from the United States laws around race, they declared that anyone who was more than 1/8 Jewish was considered only partly of the German race. Anyone who was more than half Jewish was ineligible to be a citizen, and anyone who married a Jewish person would themselves be considered Jewish, along with any children born of the marriage. By November, these laws added those of Romani descent, derogatorily referred to as the Gypsies, as well as those of African descent. Those of African descent had already been subject to sterilization laws. A biracial man by the name of Hans Hock, whose mother had become pregnant while she was in Algeria, was a member of the Hitler Youth and viewed himself as fully German, when in 1937, following a reported skull measurement, he was informed that he would be sterilized. Reportedly, the procedure was performed without anesthesia, and he was still required to serve in the military when war broke out. The law made clear that any members of these groups had no right to vote, and they were now considered not to be citizens. They were subject to segregation laws as to where they could live and work, often forced into dilapidated ghettos. While there were relatively few of African descent living in Germany, there were large Jewish and Romani populations under Nazi control that had a great deal of difficulty emigrating and found themselves trapped as war broke out with the invasion of Poland. The invasion of Poland also brought an estimated 3.5 million Polish Jews under Nazi control. Even more Jewish and Romani came under Nazi control as German territories expanded. Starting in mid-1941, Germans shifted from segregation to extermination. Estimates of the Romani murdered range from 150,000 to 1.5 million, Jewish murders between 5.5 and 6 million. As the atrocities of the Nazi eugenics program became well known following World War II, in the same city where the race laws had been written, trials for crimes being committed and the execution of these laws were held. During the Nuremberg trials, it was decided by world leaders that international law was needed beyond the previously agreed to definitions of war crimes based on the atrocities of the Nazis against their own citizens. The Soviet Union proposed the term crimes against civilians. The United States negotiator suggested instead crimes against humanity, which all the parties agreed was more fitting. The British offered as the definition, quote, murder, extermination, enslavement, deportation, and other humane acts committed against any civilian population. While all parties agreed to the definition, both the United States and the Soviet Union asked that the final version be limited to acts committed as part of a war of aggression. The Soviet Union was concerned about giving an international commission jurisdiction over how it treated its citizens. Many actions it engaged in during collectivization would fall under question. For example, a little over a decade prior, in one instance, the Russian government had engaged in an intentional mass starvation of dissidents in Ukraine during an event that is now known as Holodomor. And of course, the United States was well aware that since Jim Crow and racial segregation laws were often the model cited by the Nazis, a case could be made that they should also be labeled as crimes against humanity, unless the limit was added. History is awkward. If you enjoyed this video and you would like me to make more, please like and subscribe. Thanks.